So I'm just going to introduce who we have on our agenda this morning, and then will quickly show the agenda, and then I'll pass over to Jan. So starting with Jan Webb, who's one of our UKERC directors and Professor of Sociology of Organisations at the University of Edinburgh, very long-standing expertise in energy efficiency related and kind of governance and community related aspects of energy. Joanne Wade, who's the Chief Strategic Advisor at the Association for Centralised Energy. She's also a fellow and member of the Council of the Energy Institute, as I am, and the chair of our research committee. Simon Bennett, who is at the International Energy Agency, a long-standing interest in technology, modelling, energy system change, a background actually with a PhD from Imperial College, which he did our master's course that I used to run. So we're all friends here in that respect. We've got UKERC co-director Keith Bell. He's the Scottish Power Chair in Smart Grids at Strathclyde, and he's also the power sector specialist at the Climate Change Committee. Keith's going to be wearing two hats this morning because he's a respondent in session one, and that was planned. But he's also going to be standing in for the Climate Change Committee's David Joffe in the second session, because unfortunately David hasn't been able to join us this morning for personal reasons. Andy Manning is the Principal Economic Regulation Specialist at Citizens Advice. I've already introduced Keith, so I'm going into session two now. Mike Bradshaw, Professor of Global Energy at Warwick Business School and a UKERC co-director. We've got Simon Burley, who's a partner and UK Head of Energy at KPMG, and was one of the principal architects of electricity market reform during his time at what was then DEC, so his time in government. We've got Jen Baxter, who's the engineering director at sustainable energy company Protium, and former chief engineer at the IMEC. Doug Parr from Greenpeace, chief scientist and policy director at Greenpeace. And finally, Rachel Carey, who's from BEIS, and is leading the review of electricity market arrangements. So a really, really high profile and illustrious group of people. Amber, if you could quickly just show us the agenda, just to remind everyone of our timings. Could you make it a bit bigger, please? Thank you. Okay, so I'll be handing over in less than a minute to Jan, who's going to do a bit of scene setting. Then we've got Joanne Wade, myself talking about electricity market design, Simon, Keith and Andy, and then that's our kind of discussion session. If you could just scroll down slightly, Amber, thank you. Keith standing in for Dave Joffe, as I mentioned, from the Climate Change Committee view of the longer term, the role of gas in the transition, hydrogen, barriers to deployment of low carbon generation, and then again our panel discussion. There is a 25-minute break between about 10:30 or shortly after and 11 o'clock. If you are with us for the whole morning, very much hope that many of you will be, then it's the same joining link for both sessions. So feel free just to leave Zoom on in the background and go and get a cup of coffee, or you can leave the webinar and come back using the same link. I'm just going to quickly check that I've remembered to say everything that I was supposed to say. In fact, Amber, if I haven't remembered to say everything, just jump in and say anything that I've forgotten. And if you don't, I'll pass over to Jan, who's our chair now. Thanks, Jan.
Okay, thank you very much, Rob, and good morning, everyone. I will be chairing, as Rob said, the first part of this morning's discussions between now and about 10:30. And just a reminder, we are focusing first on the more immediate actions that we can take and contribute to managing the impact of energy prices and the fallout from the huge energy price rise in winter this year. So the next 4 months effectively. And what we've seen this week is Ofgem already announcing likely further increases of over 40%, further increases of over 40% in the retail energy price cap in October. Pretty shocking, even for those of us on a reasonable wage. So that is going to put, using Resolution Foundation stats, that is expected to put upwards of 8.5 to 10 million households, or about 40% of households, into fuel poverty or fuel stress this winter. That is, in my lifetime, and I was around in the 1970s, that is exceptional. So we're really asking what can be done in the next 4 months. Now, my background, and I think as Rob already implied, suggests that this, above all, and like in the past, is the moment for energy efficiency first, because if not now, when? The cheapest thing and the most effective thing we can do now is to use less energy and waste absolutely nothing. And there I'm thinking beyond energy, I'm also thinking about all of the food waste and how we access that. Now, obviously, stop wasting it, i.e. perfectly good food. So, because in that food is energy for humans as well as for the planet, as it were. So I want to kind of position the speakers in relation to two areas of my thinking around energy efficiency first. And starting at the ground level, if you like, neighbourhoods, community resilience, local councils, what can be done there? It's perhaps something that central governments in Britain have often been ambivalent towards, but where our research shows again and again that local knowledge and insight and social networks are invaluable in keeping people out of despair, one might say, and helping them to find ways to get through. We found in research with very low income households on an estate in Glasgow, for instance, that the resourcefulness and sense of purpose that people had from getting by with their local networks and local connections was extremely important to enabling them to cope with life's crises, inevitably, especially on low incomes. And of course, we've lost some of those community provisions, but surely now is the moment to rebuild them, thinking beyond the scale of individual households to community provisions for cooked food, somewhere where you can go to have some food to eat, and also warm places to go to meet up with others, to talk, but also maybe to read the local press, to look at what's going on, find out a bit more about what opportunities there are in your own area. But of course, I'm sharply aware there's a big element of chance there. It depends very much on whether there are some local resources to draw on. And what we're seeing is the number of households in extreme poverty by next year estimated at 1.2 million. That's from the National Institute for Economic and Social Research, recent statistics. 1.2 million facing destitution, effectively, 1.2 million households. So in an affluent, albeit very unequal society, surely no one should have to face destitution. And just a reminder that destitution in part of our society has costs for all of us in how that breaks down the social bonds and social networks. So to create some neighbourhood resilience, that mutual provisioning at neighbourhood scale needs to be matched with a decent benefit system using something like the Joseph Rowntree Foundation minimum income standard, and of course linked to price inflation. And we are waiting to see what the UK government is going to do today, but clearly benefits, the basic benefit is the key and straightforward, relatively speaking, to administer in comparison with other possible measures. And of course the other side of that is a living wage. People in work shouldn't have to be dependent on welfare. So top down in Britain, I've talked mainly about bottom up and then government policy for welfare. Top down in Britain, we've tested the efficient markets hypothesis extensively. So Rob, I think particularly, is going to talk about what we can do short term to help affordability, given our knowledge of how our energy markets are working. And as Rob has already said, we're packing in a great deal of discussion, starting with 3 15-minute presentations from Joanne, Association for Decentralised Energy, talking about energy efficiency and behaviour change, and then Rob, as I say, with some analysis of energy market opportunities, and lastly Simon Bennett from the International Energy Agency, raising some points from the EU 10-point plan. So just after 10, we move on to panel discussion with Keith Bell from UKERC and Andy Manning, Citizens Advice, before a break at 10:35. Please, if you would like to, we hope you will use the Q&A to add some comments, some questions. The panel will try to respond to those, but of course we can't promise to get round to all of them. I will do my best to keep to time. So first with Joanne Wade. Welcome, Joanne. What should we do now on energy efficiency and behaviour change?
Good morning. Thank you, Jan. Okay, so energy efficiency and behaviour change, and what is it that we can do in the next 4 months? So I'd like to cover 5 things in the next 10 minutes or so. First of all, what should we be learning from the crisis, and also the limits to what we can do in the short term? What should that teach us? Secondly, what can we achieve before next winter through energy efficiency investment? Thirdly, what does government need to do? Fourthly, what society can and should be doing? And then finally, what should we in the energy sector as a sector be doing? Okay, so what can the current crisis teach us? We have to, first of all, clearly recognise that had we been investing in home energy efficiency properly over the last 3 decades, then the current situation wouldn't be as bad as it is. But we haven't done that, and we've also got to acknowledge that we can't just put that right before next winter. There is no way that we can install sufficient energy efficiency measures between now and October to solve the energy affordability problem for all those households who might be choosing between heating and eating come October. But we can, and we must, invest in as much home energy efficiency improvement as we possibly can. We have a bunch of existing programmes that can drive that investment. We've got the Energy Company Obligation, the Home Upgrade Grant, the Social Housing Decarbonisation Fund, the complementary programmes that the devolved administrations run alongside these programmes. We need to get those getting investment into people's homes as fast as we practically can. While we're doing that, however, we must be focusing on making sure that we're helping the people who need help the most, and that we're investing in the measures that will most reduce next winter's energy use. So, step 1, we have to do that. Government and the energy efficiency supply chains need to work together to try and expand activity under those programmes to whatever extent is practically possible between now and next winter. But they've got to do that in a way that sets us up properly for the longer term push that we must make to transform our resilience through better energy performance. So that's the first role for government, working with the energy efficiency supply chains and getting those programmes moving and growing. Secondly, as I think is a completely uncontentious point, government has to increase the financial help that's available for people on low incomes in the worst housing. We're starting to hear this morning about what they might be going to do. We're not quite sure what the details are. I think the only thing that I would add at this point is really government shouldn't be giving any more money to those of us who are able to pay our bills. All the extra money should be going to the people who can't. But given that whatever it is the government announces it's going to do this morning, it's not going to be enough to help everybody as much as they need to be helped. We also need to think about a societal response. And that's where behaviour change comes in. While I was preparing for this morning, I, as you won't be at all surprised to hear, consulted Nick Eyre, who's director of the Centre for Research on Energy Demand Solutions. And those of you who know him will be not surprised that he came up with lots of great ideas, many of which I am stealing shamelessly this morning. But one thing in particular that he shared with me was some examples of just how much energy we can save doing quite simple things. And I'm just going to use two of those this morning. The first one is, if the people in the warmest 50% of homes reduce their average temperatures by 2 degrees C, we could save 30 terawatt hours a year. That's around 6.5% of annual gas use in homes. Or if we reduce the maximum speed on major roads from 70 miles an hour to 60 miles an hour, we could save 10 to 15 terawatt hours a year, 2 or 3% of total transport energy use. Those are just two examples. So given that we have this potential out there to change the way we do things a bit and save quite a lot of energy, I think we have to ask ourselves, why is our government not talking to us all now about how we can reduce our energy use? If we were giving this seminar from Germany or Italy, we'd have been hearing our governments telling us how to save energy and exhorting us to do that as much as we possibly could. Maybe the difference is that there is a clear and present danger to national energy security in those countries right now. Whilst for the UK, there's a bit of a perception that this is actually more about personal energy security. Now, okay, the fact that up to 40% of households in the UK next winter may have a personal energy security problem should be enough for that conversation to start. But let's just think more widely as well for a minute. Are we safe in making the assumption that this is not a national energy security problem? Is it not possible that ongoing political and economic issues could threaten national energy security next winter? If that is the case, then surely we should be talking about a collective effort to reduce energy use so that we're not at risk of power cuts or 1970s style 3-day weeks for energy intensive industries. So we have to start that conversation. And I think we need two main strands to that. First of all, for everybody, I think we need a 4-month campaign to ensure that by the end of September, we all have strategies that we need to use to minimize our energy use without endangering our health and well-being. As part of that, particularly for the people who are struggling to afford even the basics at the moment, we need to make sure that the infrastructures are in place for people to actually action those strategies. Jan's already talked about the local networks and the community provision that is very patchy around the country. Some people have access to it, some people don't. We need to try and ensure that everybody has that kind of support at a community level. But we also need to think about individually what do people need. And it's simple stuff. I'm talking about, you know, the thick curtains, the usable heating controls, the blankets, things like a pressure cooker or slow cooker or microwave and the recipes that go with them. All those small bits of the infrastructures of daily life, as well as the community side of things, need to be in place so that people can change their behaviour. That campaign needs possibly to be led by, certainly to be co-designed by, the civil society organisations that understand the lived experience of struggling families. Because struggling families already have really quite well evolved coping strategies. They are very good at managing their energy use, and they don't need to be told what to do when it's stuff they're already doing. They need new ideas of how to gain even more from the limited amount of energy that they can afford. But it does need to be backed and funded by central government. Some of the money needs to go on this. Alongside that, for those of us who are resilient to energy price rises and could, if we chose, just pay more, well, first of all, given what's being talked about this morning, maybe we all just need to donate the money that government's about to give us to local charities that are working with low-income households. But more than that, I think we need a challenge. I think we need to be challenged to pledge to reduce our energy use by an amount that we choose, and then to donate that money to charities that are working in our local communities. And our energy suppliers can work with us on that, making good use of our smart meter data to both help us decide how much energy we can save, and also to give us more ideas about how to do it. Because in this current crisis, you know, we're definitely not all in the same boat, but we are all in the same storm. And I think one thing that COVID did show us is that there are a lot of people in this country who do want to work as a community to make sure that the whole flotilla makes it through to the other side of the storm. And that brings me to the last point that I want to make in these introductory remarks. Businesses are part of society. We're talking this morning both about the short-term crisis response in this session and later about the longer-term challenge for the energy system. So I'd like to end my initial remarks with a specific challenge for the energy sector that responds to the short-term crisis, that contributes to meeting the long-term resilient decarbonisation challenge, and also tackles a long-standing issue that we've had in the sector, which is what the public think of us. Do the public trust the energy sector? So I'd like to say to those energy companies who are experiencing a windfall from current global prices, why don't you spend half of that, whatever's left after whatever tax is going to be introduced? Why don't you spend half of it via charities or possibly local authorities to help the people in your local communities who are at the sharp end of this crisis? And why don't you invest the other half in long-term decarbonisation, including, and this is important, including by diversifying into energy services companies so that the energy sector is part of decarbonising and making more resilient to any future shocks the UK's homes and the UK's businesses. I don't want to say any more at this point. I think that's enough of an introduction on energy efficiency and behaviour change. I'd rather leave more time for the discussion at the end. So that's me done for now. Thank you.
So on to you, Rob. Thank you very much, Joanne, and on to Rob.
Sorry, I didn't mean to jump in ahead of you there. Thanks, Joanne. Now, I was going to say, and now for something completely different from me, and about halfway through what Joanne was saying, I thought I still would, but then she provided me with a wonderful segue into talking a bit more about wholesale electricity markets and the kind of the role of the generation sector. So I do have some slides which I'm going to try and share. Which obviously has the potential to go wrong, but it should be coming up now, and I'll just put it into show view. Okay, I'm just going to change that up and down, and Jan, if you could just tell me whether you can see my slides and that they're moving.
We can see them.
Thank you very much. Okay, fine. Okay, so this is I'm going to run through this quite quickly. It's a piece of work that some colleagues and I, also including Keith, who's here today, did in a big rush last month to put forward an idea for how we could save energy, how we could save reduce bills, save money immediately and next winter by using the contracts for difference auction, but making a new what we called Pot Zero contracts for difference auction available to existing generators. This helps, I think, to understand whether or not the idea is viable or not. It helps to understand the scale of the potential for us to reduce electricity prices straight away, given that we get almost 60% of our electricity from things other than gas, but the price of gas most of the time sets the prevailing wholesale electricity market spot price, and that feeds through to consumers. And that's one of the most fundamental issues that faces us both in the short term and the long term when we're looking at how to decarbonize. So this is really, really important stuff that also speaks to the conversation that has already been mentioned, alluded to, around whether or not we should have a windfall tax on generators as well as on upstream oil and gas. Because essentially you can do two things to try and bring electricity prices down. You can have a windfall to try and redistribute from high prices to poorer consumers using a tax, or you can try and bring prices down by intervening in the electricity market. And in this instance, I'm talking about the wholesale electricity market, not the consumer end of things, which obviously, as we've seen under the price cap, is not something that's sustainable when wholesale prices are extremely high. Okay, there's a few busy slides here, and I'm going to rattle through them quite fast. I'm not going to try and read everything out. The first thing to say is that we all know that we had an unprecedented increase in gas prices last year before Christmas, going up 500% within months, and then up to a 600% increase at the start of the war in Ukraine, and they've been fluctuating up and down, but still something like 3 or 4 times higher than the 10-year average. What's now referred to as BESS, the security strategy, was very supply side oriented, and I'm sure we'll come back to that in discussion. But it was also very focused on building new stuff for the future, which will obviously take time. Even the quickest to build of the new renewables schemes like onshore wind and solar are going to take years to come to fruition. We need to focus on what we can do next winter. And we already know that we have a whole bunch of existing wind farms, solar farms and nuclear power stations, all of which have in effect paid the prevailing wholesale price. And in the case of many of the wind and solar generators, a subsidy on top of that through the renewables obligation. And is that sensible? And could we do something a bit different? And so we came up with this idea of a pot zero CFD for existing generators. And I'll try and explain that now. I'll try and explain it in a way that non-electricity market aficionados that is intelligible to, although that's a challenge. The first thing is that we've got something of the order of about 6 gigawatts of the most recent renewables projects under something called a contract for difference. In effect, that gives them a long-term fixed price contract. If a wholesale price is high, they get paid more than that. If the wholesale price is low, they get paid more than that. If the wholesale price is high, they effectively pay back to suppliers, which ought to pass through to consumers. But most of our renewables generators, and obviously none of our existing nuclear power stations, are under the CFD. Instead, they get they just get the wholesale price in the case of the nuclear stations, or they get the wholesale price plus a renewable obligation certificate in the case of most of those renewables. We've seen the bid prices for new renewable schemes as low as 40 or 50 pounds per megawatt hour. We also know that nuclear generators were running quite happily on 40 or 50 pounds per megawatt hour, or even less, only less than a year ago. And currently, for the 6-month period from October to April this year, the wholesale market spot price was above 200 pounds per megawatt hour almost all of the time, even on windy and sunny days. So there was clearly a large amount of money that was flowing through to those generators. Now, we're not trying to beat them up. It's not their fault. We were just trying to come up with a scheme that might be able to use existing arrangements and, if you like, offer a reduced price now in return for some long-term price stability. And that was this idea of a pot zero CFD. There's there's some detailed stuff here around our methodology that I won't try and explain this morning, just because for lack of time, but very, very happy to pick up on that or to take it out after the workshop. And then we ran a bunch of scenarios of what we thought the clearing price could be, and how wide, what the kind of volume would be of participation in this scheme that we came up with. So some existing renewables obligation renewables, all existing renewables obligation renewables, plus DRAX, plus our newest nuclear power station, and plus then all of our older AGR generators as well, and different kind of clearing price scenarios. And these are the findings. So these give you a sense of the scale of the impact, and you can maybe reflect upon some of the sizes of the numbers here when you're reading about the proposals for a windfall tax when that's announced later in the day. So the total saving, if it's only half of existing renewables, is 5 billion per year and per household. So we're not just smearing 5 billion across households. By the way, we're taking the fraction that households use of that 5 billion, and it's about £70 saving, and all the way through to about £300 saving. Now, this completely obviously contingent on what your counterfactual is. This is if prices are as high next winter as they were last winter, and it's if the clearing price for our auction is relatively low. But it gives you a sense of the kind of the order of magnitude that's currently flowing through the wholesale market because of gas setting the price all of the time. And this has, we have discussed this with government. I think it's that they see some impediments to this, particularly the idea that we might be unwinding the RO, which is retroactive rule changing. But I think that some of those objections could actually be overcome because we wouldn't necessarily need to unwind the RO. And anyway, that's not relevant to new nuclear. Whether we can do this in time for next winter is also a question. But we've seen emergency legislation pushed through in France, in the Spain, Portugal system to cap wholesale prices, to oblige EDF to generate below the marginal price on the wholesale market. And this is a way that potentially could open up the possibility of actually beginning to take advantage of the fact that because gas prices are so high, because we've made such great progress with renewables rollout, we have the potential for cheaper electricity from greener sources. Whether they take part or not is something that we could discuss, but we suggest the scheme should be voluntary so that we're not trying to kind of retroactively change rules. Now, we think this should be the jumping off point for a conversation with industry, with government, and with civil society. As I've said, and as we know, the focus would appear to be on a windfall tax at the moment. That also has all sorts of issues and kind of discussion around it. I hope that's enough to kind of provoke a bit of conversation in this space. And I'll stop there. Look forward to the discussion that follows. Thanks, Jen.
Okay, thank you very much, Rob. And so we've got two rather nicely juxtaposed presentations there so far. One literally on the markets and on how those wholesale markets are working and the potential to intervene there. And from Joanne, very much that community level and how to create momentum at a societal scale through and indeed across sectors in society. So I look forward to hearing Simon's presentation, Simon Bennett, to whom I'll pass right now, to talk about the EU 10-point plan and what we can learn from that for next winter. Thank you.
Thank you, Jen, and thanks to the previous panelists. It's a pleasure to be invited to speak here, and it's going to be hard for me to find a segue from Rob's presentation right into what I'd like to say, but it's a great opportunity to share with you some work that the IEA did shortly after the crisis in Ukraine began to unfold around what Europe and then the world can do in order to lessen its reliance on Russian gas and oil in particular. Crucially, this is not the EU's plan. What I'm going to present is the IEA's input into the thinking of the European Union member states and the European Commission, and then the thinking of IEA members and advanced economies more generally. And finally, something around what we felt could be useful to communicate to citizens, because this is a very notable moment in world energy. Our executive director, Fatih Birol, has called this the first global energy crisis. And I think what he means by that is the globalized nature of energy systems today. Distinguish this from the crises that led to the IEA's forming back in the 70s, which were really crises for the rich world energy importers. This is a global crisis, and it's turned not only from being an energy crisis now into a food and social crisis, and also not just in Europe, but around the world. And we were already in a mode of looking at the energy system through a new security lens, even before the war in Ukraine. We had, as Rob mentioned, the rising prices through last autumn, and a number of other reasons as we came out of the pandemic, or continued through the pandemic, that were giving us some serious concerns about the near term in energy markets. And we recognized relatively early on, I think, what this could mean for energy systems. And in early March, the IEA released what it called a 10-point plan to reduce the EU's reliance on Russian natural gas. And that was quickly followed by a 10-point plan on oil. It's a challenge when you're presenting 10-point plans, I'm afraid, to do much other than to read from a list. So I'm going to share my screen, and hopefully we will be able to sort of work through that list without, I'm not seeing the right screen here. Allow me just a moment to see if I can get the right screen up to share, because I think that's going to share the wrong one. Well, this worked perfectly well in rehearsal. Let's just quickly try it again. We're also unable to get this to share the PowerPoint screen.
Let me know if you want me to share for you, Simon.
Yeah, maybe if you could. I'm just not able to select the PowerPoint window when it
No worries.
comes to screen sharing. Look at this. That's why we had a backup. Okay, so if you could allow that to go full screen.
Yeah. Sorry, the Zoom controls are in the way. 1 second. There we go.
So anyway, so what I think the IEA has added to this conversation is not only something of a quantification of what different measures can actually achieve in line with the EU's objective to significantly reduce its dependence, but also look at the types of measures that could be most impactful. And I think the messages fit very well with this session, because what we're talking about is reducing reliance in a hurry. So what can be done in the following few months so that we have significantly lower demand for Russian gas as Europe goes into winter 2022 to 2023. I mentioned the distinction between the EU's own plan and the Repower EU communication was released last week. That communication really focuses on 2027 and 2030 as targets, actions that they need to step up now, but will deliver even larger savings by the end of the decade. What we're talking about here is savings by the end of the year. And so we brought together the different experts across the IEA. We didn't have much time, but we used our modeling tools and we reached out to a number of stakeholders in order to try to work out what is a sensible list of actions. We're very pleased that not only has the European Commission adopted some of these, but we've seen some EU member states adopt some of the measures, and it's reflected in the UK conversation as well. The first thing that we had on the list was around the 15 BCM of natural gas that is currently under pipeline contract with Russia, but those contracts will expire in the coming months, some of which have already expired. It was a relatively simple recommendation to not renew any of those contracts. To put that in context, as of last year, the European Union was importing something like 140 BCM of natural gas through pipelines from Russia and about 15 BCM through LNG. And that's around 45% of total EU gas imports, 40% of total EU gas consumption. Okay. 15 BCM is significant. It doesn't get you the off gas entirely. You still need to find a replacement for that gas. So action 2 was about finding alternative sources, and we felt that 30 BCM could be secured from other sources, mostly LNG, in the next year. Now, obviously, that has impacts on global gas markets, and that's something that we're working through now. And it's also been modified slightly in terms of the thinking by the EU sanctions, or the sanctions around the world that have been placed on certain Russian retailers of gas, that has led to changes in some of the other long-term contracts and how likely they are to still be in place by the end of this year, or indeed by the end of the decade. And then action 3 is around minimum gas storage obligations to enhance market resilience by the end of the year. I think those are Those are relatively self-explanatory. None of those reduce demand for gas. They're not on the demand side. Whereas the other actions very much are. And we have reducing demand in the electricity sector, so actions 4 and 5 around accelerating the deployment of new wind and solar projects. Rob mentioned the difficulty of bringing some of those online, but across the EU, we were looking for signs that there were projects that were already received planning permission, but the permitting could be accelerated. Some of the red tape could be eased in order to get those projects up and running. We think that could be worth around 6 BCM of natural gas. And then in order to further reduce the amount of gas that is dispatched more flexibly in order to meet balancing needs and to ensure stability on the grid, we looked at whether nuclear and bioenergy could actually increase their load factors. And we thought that could be worth even more, so that's around 13 BCM. Then if you look at actions 7, 8, and 9, there we're actually quite quickly moving away from supply side measures, even in the electricity sector. I think there's a lot that end consumers can do in terms of replacing boilers with heat pumps, accelerating energy efficiency improvements in the short term. And then one of the things that got picked up quite widely in the media was just the amount of gas that we calculated could be saved simply by reducing thermostats by 1 degree through this winter and then next winter. And that's around 10 BCM. And 10 BCM is more than the heat pumps, it's more than the efficiency, which were around 2 BCM each. I know it's difficult to keep up with all the numbers here, but to put that in context, when Joanne talks about the behavioural measures that could be important here, and we've really started to make sure that we're including the behavioural measures in our own modelling and in the World Energy Outlook work that we do, we were finding that the behavioural measures were some of the most impactful in this whole package around natural gas, which was very interesting to see that not only would it require consumers to be acting voluntarily, but then there were measures that the governments could be taking in order to facilitate better use of energy within households. And that distinction between sort of voluntary behavioural measures and facilitated behavioural measures, I think, then really began to become visible when we started talking about the oil 10-point plan. So the only other thing I want to highlight before we go on to the next slide is action 6, which is actually around whether these short-term measures to shelter vulnerable electricity consumers can be funded from windfall taxes on profits. And we didn't go into great details. One of the challenges about being a global agency is that we recognize the national context for being able to enact some of these are very different. And obviously some countries are more willing to go on to something akin to a war footing related to both energy security and also the geopolitics than others will be. So Amber, if you can move to the next slide. Because about 2 weeks after we produced the gas plan to feed into the European Commission's thinking, our 10-point plan, I think, was different in 2 ways. Firstly, it couldn't just be focused on the EU because of the integrated nature of global oil markets. What you're trying to do with a plan to cut oil use in a hurry is to impact the marginal price of wholesale price of oil in certain key nodes around the world. And we're seeing that the impacts of a higher oil price are not just present in the European Union. And the second is that you have much less opportunity to intervene on the supply side, whether it's in the electricity market or the actual purchasing of oil when it comes to cutting oil use. So if you look across these 10 measures, whether they are reducing speed limits on highways, working from home up to 3 days a week, car-free Sundays, making public transport cheaper, enforcing a system where cars with alternately sort of odd even number plates can drive in cities. These types of things are really behavioral change measures. And there's a mix here between what consumers can do on a voluntary basis and what governments are going to probably have more luck facilitating if they put in place emergency legislation or or even municipalities. Some of these things could actually be more effectively imposed by local governments. And when we looked for these measures, what we were looking for, in fact, was examples where some of these things had been done before. And we found that each of these measures has been effected mostly with some decent success in municipalities or countries around the world, especially things that even perhaps would have seemed draconian a decade ago around odd even number plates. That's become a part of legislation for curbing traffic pollution in some major cities. And the amounts of oil use that you can actually cut through these 10 measures are amounting to something like 2.7 million barrels per day. And at the margins, that's pretty significant. The IEA has mobilized an oil stock release in the last couple of months that is worth 120 million barrels. So when you translate that into barrels per day, it's around 500,000 barrels per day. These measures, which are mostly on the behavioral and demand side, are worth significantly more than that. And the 120 million barrels that was announced in the US oil stock reserve went even further. That does have a calming influence on markets. And they, across these 10 measures, unlike the gas one, where there was wide variability in what they would be achieving, each of these measures is somewhere around 0.2 or 0.4 million barrels per day of global oil consumption. And we would expect that most of these measures would be enacted in advanced economies rather than in emerging and developing countries. And so that's how we did the modeling. If we move to the next slide, I'm just going to illustrate how important we now think the behavioral aspects are and the citizen change aspects in the short term and the long term in order to make the emergency measures that governments are taking consistent with their long-term climate targets. Because beginning to change the way that society approaches its use to energy actually gives us a lot more space a lot more headroom in order to be able to make the transition that's necessary towards net zero. So we published this about a month after the oil plan and really wanted to communicate to the general public through the media that there are things that really do make a difference. And it's mostly a combination of the other things that I've already presented, including taking high-speed rail wherever it's possible. We think that 2% of all aviation activity could actually be shifted onto high-speed rail in the world. I think that is, rather than just in Europe, makes a big difference to oil consumption. And then the use of public transport. This is the suggestion that governments could actually make public transport more affordable, free in some cases. And something that has been, I think, tried and tested through the pandemic is government investments in shifting citizens out of their cars and onto bike lanes and other non-motorized forms of transport. So that's something that's included here in our point out. We really think that that's been quite successful in many countries through the pandemic. I'd rather not just continue to read off lists. So I'm happy to cover any of this in the Q&A that follows. I did have one final slide that I just wanted to bring out because it may be helpful in the context of this UK discussion, which is that alongside what the European Commission has done, alongside what the IEA has promoted, what we see around Europe is actually quite a wide range of different measures by governments to try to manage the crisis of living costs and also to manage their own energy security concerns for industry and for their own economies. So I've just listed a few of them here because I just think it's quite interesting that they are quite varied. France has put a cap on the regulated electricity tariff rise at 4%, and it's used a particular regulation around access to historic investments in nuclear energy in order to cap or to ensure that EDF sells more electricity at a lower price. Germany has an emergency plan for gas, which is raised to an early warning level, and that's different. It very much gives the gas network operators significant powers to limit provision and redirect supplies. Italy has opted for a 10% one-shot levy on profit margins, like a windfall tax, in order to fund tax credit cuts for oil and gas consumers. On the electricity side, that's particularly larger consumers, and have a tax break, whereas for the household it is a cut in prices that they can actually impose nationally. And then lastly, this is something that the European Council approved just last week, where Finland has had to get a derogation on state aid in order to reduce the tax rates on electricity that are supplied to anything that is generating heat from electricity rather than natural gas. And they've got that derogation for 5 years. So there are other measures. Rob's already mentioned the Iberian Peninsula and the measures that Spain and Portugal have taken, which are slightly different again in the way that they're capping electricity prices. But I thought that might be useful to feed into the discussion. That's all that I wanted to cover today, and I'm looking forward to the Q&A.
Okay. Thank you very much, Simon. I think the three pieces there fitted very well together and complemented each other very well, looking at that societal level, directed change, community scale, markets, and what can be done within existing markets, and then thinking about, in a way, Simon, I think talking about the pieces in the middle that might bring some of these together, and indeed looking at the opportunities for changing the way we use energy and how governments can help to direct and organise some of those key changes in the short term. So I'd like to turn now to our panel to make some initial responses to those three presentations. We have Keith Bell and Andy Manning on our panel, and how we're going to do this is Andy is going to start by responding to the three presentations, and then Keith will come in with some initial responses to those presentations, and then we'll turn to getting responses both from our speakers but also addressing at least a proportion of the questions that have come up already. So if you would like to put more into that Q&A bar, please do, and we'll try and come back to them. Please upvote them if you think there's something there you would particularly like addressed. Okay, so Andy, can I ask you to respond to our presentations first, please?
Thanks, Jan, and thanks to everyone. It's a pleasure to join you. I think I'll be doing a lot of agreeing, which is good, but I will try and do it swiftly and then add some extra points. But before I go on to that, it's worth pointing out what citizens' advice role is. So we are the statutory advocate. So here I am, but also there's a frontline role, helping people both in the local offices and through the national service, and that is getting increasingly difficult. There's clearly more and more people coming for support, and now the options that we've got in providing that support are diminishing. So traditionally, one of the first things you do would be advising people to change supplier, and they could save hundreds of pounds doing that, and that's now gone because we don't have effectively the market operating in a competitive way. So we've got people on the front line offering support, which is just getting harder and harder. But to go on to the things we've heard, I think again, so Joanne was going through. I think that's almost, a lot of that is almost precisely where citizens' advice are. I won't labour too much bits about converting the rebate into a grant and increased amount of support, other than to agree with Joanne that the bulk of it needs to be targeted support. But we'll hear more of that probably later this morning, so I won't go on too much. So moving on to energy efficiency. Again, we absolutely need to supercharge the existing mechanisms for delivering energy efficiency and make better use of data matching to make sure we're targeting at vulnerable customers. One specific on that, just to add, one of the current schemes, so the next version of the energy company obligation is currently, so that's ECO4, is currently delayed going through Parliament, and that creates a risk, particularly around the supply chains. As Joanne was saying, it's very important the supply chains can gear up to deliver the energy efficiency in short order. So there's a specific there about ECO4 that needs to be delivered. And again, agreeing with Joanne, and also it plays into Simon's part about everyone being able to play their part. we absolutely call for a government-led campaign to support and inform people about how they can manage their energy usage. And the add-on to that is we'd like to see an expanded national energy advice service, so customers have somewhere they can go to get independent and reliable advice. So that's a lot of agreeing with everything that's said. I guess my reflection is that at the moment, citizen advice are very much, as you'd expect, focused on what consumers need. So we haven't focused so much on effectively where does the funding come from that. But I'm very interested to explore the ideas around that and around Rob's suggestions about the CFD. My brain's not quite big enough to assess it all on the fly, but I think we'd be really keen to engage with that. So that's my reflections. A lot of agreements with a lot of the content so far, and found it all very interesting. So thanks, Jan.
Okay, thank you very much, Andy, for leading off there. Keith, would you like to come in and make some responses to what you've heard so far?
Yeah, great. Thanks very much. And thanks for the invitation to be here. Obviously, energy security is a term that gets used a hell of a lot, and it's clearly really important. It shouldn't mean, it doesn't mean, or shouldn't, if the system operators are doing their job properly, mean that shortages of supply mean that all the lights go out, or everyone's gas pressure disappears. However, it might mean lights dimming under certain circumstances, or really worst case, and this has happened in other countries around the world at different times, rolling disconnections. More likely, however, shortage means, as it has already done, high prices, and high prices mean sort of self-rationing, where a household can't afford to pay for all of the energy that it needs to keep warm or to cook. And we're starting to see some of that happening. So that's not kind of voluntary action to reduce demand, if you like, that we've already talked about. And I totally agree with Joanne and Simon and Andy on the need for us to save energy. And we've already noted that it's something that seems to be unpopular here. It's certainly unpopular for politicians to even mention the possibility of it. But there's less reticence to address the need for it in other countries, for example, in France. And as we've noted, it can be done without significantly adversely impacting on most people. Now, the energy industry ought to be able to help, but parts of it, in terms of advising on energy efficiency, but parts of it have already not done the greatest job really at communicating that. So as Andy was mentioning, who can be trusted to communicate in a clear way what can be done. In Scotland, I believe an independent energy advice service has been promised by the Scottish government, and I think it's in preparation, in development. But on the other hand, the energy retailers, especially if they've got access to so-called smart automated meter readings, ought to be able to identify who's most likely to need support. So really they do have a role. Now, of course, reducing peak demand for electricity or gas ought to reduce the average wholesale price, as you don't need to go so far up the supply curve. And reducing the peak can be done by time shifting of demand. So that helps. But if it's only time shifting, we'd be using just as much energy. And so we'd be just as dependent on buying gas from the global market. So, we do need genuine demand reduction. Now, I mean, there's some other issues, of course. Doing without Russian gas means other fields in the short term to medium term to be used more. And there are emissions associated with other sources. For example, methane leakage in the US, and the US is, promised to increase production from fracking. Now, so that maybe and in Germany using more hard coal and lignite, again there are adverse emissions impacts arising from that. Okay, so for this winter, all these other things we should be doing of improving energy efficiency and growing the use of renewables, we're doing them as quick as we can. We need to do them more quickly. Can we do very much for this winter? Perhaps not, but we certainly need to then compensate for the adverse effects of this winter by going even faster for these other things, energy efficiency and renewables subsequently. Now, a definition of energy supply resilience is the ability to prevent, contain, recover from interruptions to supply arising from disturbances. And those disturbances could be physical, such as faults on the network. We saw during Storm Arwen, for example, breakdowns of generation or shortages of fuel. But it could also be a disturbance due to price, price disturbance leading to inability to pay. We should have enough energy conversion capacity and, in the electricity sector, interconnector capacity. But, as we just noted about the supplies of fuel, will we have enough energy supplies sitting behind those facilities to be able to use them? In respect of electricity interconnectors for the coming winter, there is a risk there. It's part of the mix of where we get our electricity from. I was talking to a colleague from France just earlier this week. They are very unsure about how much nuclear capacity they're going to have. And anywhere between 30 and 50 gigawatts. So that's a huge range of uncertainty. And just for a sense of scale, Great Britain's peak electricity demand is somewhere between 50 and 60 gigawatts, the highest we get in the winter. So, a 20 gigawatt kind of uncertainty for the coming winter is massive. And I think, maybe one final point I'll make here is, that kind of resilience point again. Yes, the energy industry has an important part to play, but it's not only up to the energy industry. There's also kind of support mechanisms that could be put in place. We've seen during the storms over last winter, things like local resilience forums or local resilience partnerships can help there. Of course, as I say, the energy industry has a critical role to play, but government at national, devolved and local levels also needs to step up and not just leave things to the kinds of voluntary community actions that Joanne talked about. Okay.
Thank you very much, Keith. Can I please invite all of our speakers and panel members now to put their cameras on and to be ready to come into the discussion, including Rob. Thank you. So, Rob, do you first want to respond with any brief comments to what you've heard this morning, having opened up the session right at the start?
Yeah, thanks, Joanne. Thanks, Jan. Sorry. The reason I said Joanne is because I found some of Joanne's remarks really sort of interesting and really quite provocative about the potential to put this onto a bit more of an emergency footing and to change the way that this is being I suppose it's the narrative around this that there's a sense of concern about the impact on consumers that's very widely shared in the media conversation and in the way that the government is thinking about it. But there isn't really a sense of this being something that requires a kind of a national emergency type approach. That there are things that could be done that we should. I mean, we've advocated with UKERC that there should be some kind of plan of action through the summer focused on the low-hanging fruit for energy efficiency, helping people to prepare for next winter, which I think is very much aligned with what you were saying, Joanne. And my idea was, why couldn't that be in collaboration with the big DIY chains, to help people to fix drafts and so on. But I think you kind of made that more, you broadened it to be thinking. I mean, it's interesting, isn't it? We have a 70-mile-an-hour speed limit because it was introduced in the 1970s oil crises, and it's stuck. And we have all of these motorways now where these kind of things come up that make you do 60 miles an hour because there's congestion. So we could be, there's so many options that could be adopted, it seems to me, with the political will to do so. And probably we could have another conversation about whether or why that political will is absent and what the concerns actually might be. And I suppose an observation would be that perhaps the potential for the able to pay, you mentioned the warmest households, to turn the thermostat down, very readily misplays in the conversation and translates into asking the poorest households to turn their thermostats down when they're already probably not really adequately heating their homes. They should be heating their homes like gingerbread houses, heating their homes. And it seems to me that kind of communication and narrative issue is one of the things that we should be also beginning to think about and address, because it speaks to everything, it seems to me, because it speaks to what we could do on the supply side as well as what we could do on the demand side. And it speaks to some of the points that Keith was making about how we keep prepared, and some of Andy's observations as well, and also, of course, some of the things Simon was saying about what's being done by our near neighbours. So I'll stop there for now.
Okay, thank you, Rob. Joanne, that sounds to me like an invitation to you to come back in to respond. Should we be thinking of this, and should we be pushing as a research community, apart from anything else, for more of that emergency mindset in the immediate future?
Yes, I think we should. And I think the way that the narrative plays out, I hope you can still hear me because I look like I've frozen. You can still hear me. Good. Okay. The way that the narrative plays out, if you look at the energy security strategy, things like this, consumers are seen as passive recipients at the end of the energy system. So we've got to fix the energy system rather than consumers as part of the system. So let's all work together to sort out this problem. And I think as well as moving on to slightly more of a crisis footing, we also ought to stop thinking about consumers as recipients of the energy system and start thinking about them as part of the energy system, which would then change the narrative about how we collectively solve the problem.
Yeah, I'm in fierce agreement with you on that, of course. I'm sure I shouldn't be saying that as chair. Simon, do you have a particular point you want to add to that at present, or shall we turn to some of the Q&A?
I mean, I'll just say a couple of words from our perspective of looking across a number of different countries and different discussions, which is that it was interesting to see that some countries did take more of what you might be terming an emergency type of response, communicating to the general public that this was an area where it might be necessary for citizens to make, especially the wealthier citizens, to make some sacrifices in order to tackle what is a very, very serious crisis on the European Union's borders right now. But even if you look a little bit beyond some of those sort of war footing measures, if you want to reduce gas demand by next winter, if you want to, or make sure that you've got secure supplies through storage, if you want to reduce oil demand through the driving season this summer, those are you're on immediately, I think, on an emergency footing in the policy dimension, even if it's not translating through as an emergency for households necessarily. And I don't think we've necessarily seen the kinds of mobilization in some of the ministries in order to get the faster permitting of renewables, the energy efficiency measures, or some of these other measures that would facilitate behavioral change in place. And yet, when we look at the packages of things people are proposing 12, 24, 36 months ago in order to reach net zero targets, it's often a very similar package of measures. What we're really asking governments to do is to mobilize the homework they've already done and accelerate it in the short term.
Okay, right, thank you. So on that note, perhaps we can turn to one of the question areas that has already attracted some discussion in the Q&A, and that I think goes to the heart of the presentations we've heard this morning and points coming up, which is really asking about the interface between supply and use. And this was from Agatha earlier on, and then a couple of responses to that have come into the Q&A. But let's go back to that original statement, which was that since most UK households, or certainly British households, are heated with gas and not electricity, does it matter? Would it matter if we had that pot zero contract for difference or a similar model? Would that really have a significant impact on the price of energy, the retail prices of energy for those households? And what does it do to that argument around whether we should be shifting heat onto electrification?
I guess that comes at me, doesn't it? But I would be interested in others coming in on it. So, one of the responses, Dan Gray, has kind of answered the question for me, really. I don't think it matters to householders whether their gas boiler is the bill for their gas has gone down or the bill for their electricity has gone down. If one of their bills has gone down, then it's reduced their outgoings on energy. A lot of people are on dual fuel tariffs. That tariff, if you could feed these costs, wholesale market price reductions through to consumers, it would reduce their bill, and that's really all that we're focused on with the work that we've done. A couple of people have made comments in the chat about gas heating going to heat pumps and all of those kinds of things. Somebody said electricity is 4 times more expensive than gas. Clearly, there's a bigger, longer term conversation about wholesale market price formation and electricity market reform, shifting some of the environmental tariffs off electricity and onto gas or into general taxation. So, some of the analysis that we've done does speak to that longer term conversation as well. And we don't really quite know yet. Collectively, I don't think a solution has been agreed, but it does seem odd. And it would seem very strange, I think, at some point in a largely decarbonised future, where most of our electricity is being generated by renewables and nuclear, to still be in a world where the system marginal price is set by the price of gas. And so that because there's 2 things that you want the electricity price to do. So one is to signal scarcity by time of day. So as demand goes up, prices go up, new generation comes on, and you meet that demand. But the second thing that mechanism also passes through to consumers is wholesale gas price volatility, and that's actually of no benefit to anybody other than the gas producers. If you're getting most of your electricity generation from non-gas sources, and it seems to me that that's the kind of fundamental difficulty that our current electricity market design enters us into. And the idea of the work that we did was to see if we could use the existing arrangements to provide a partial solution to that. Because we do, some people dislike the CFD for a number of reasons, see it as interventionist, for example. But it unequivocally provides a means by which we have a bit of an equivalent of a fixed rate mortgage for our electricity generators that are under the CFD arrangements. They get paid if the wholesale price is too low. They pay back if the wholesale price is too high. And given the fact that what we're moving towards in the future are these zero marginal cost sort of big assets, they're expensive to build and they're cheap or free to run. And they sit there and they make electricity whenever it's windy or all of the time. We have to figure out how to make much better use of those to the benefit of consumers, as well as the companies that have made the investments in them. And that's really where I think this needs to be taken in the conversation.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you, Keith. It looks like you want to respond to that.
Yeah, thanks. I just want to thank Sitar, who's put a comment in the Q&A, just pointing out that yes, Home Energy Scotland is a service that's been going for a long time in Scotland. I believe there's an energy agency that's also been discussed for quite a while, and we'll be complementing that or feeding into that. So thanks for the clarification. I mean, a big bit that was missing, as many people have said, from the energy security strategy that came out last month was stuff on the demand side. And it's lots of what we've talked about this morning already. And another piece that needs to be addressed, as Rob has picked up, is the sort of, not just what the costs are, but how the costs are recovered and the sort of distributional impacts. So yeah, shifting, if you like, the sort of legacy costs of getting the renewables sector going, and then which has proved really successful in terms of driving down the cost of energy from renewables, the kind of learning by doing thing. What's the best way of recovering those historic costs, and how do you split the bill for that? The bill's not zero, okay, but and similarly, the right answer going forward is more energy efficiency, lower carbon production, and heat pumps. Well, in fact, as I'll point out in the second session, electrification of a large part of our use of energy does provide energy efficiency benefits. But there is investment in a capital stock, changing the kind of equipment, whether it's heat pumps in homes or moving from combustion engine vehicles to electric vehicles, or investment to improve access to public transport and so on. So how are those costs borne? What's the distributional impact? And in the short term, we can see, well, those things need to be addressed. And a big part of what we need to do. Things could be done, as Simon was pointing out. Some of these things have been done in other countries in the short term, and they're really important part of what we need to do in the long term as well. We've already seen impacts. I'm interested in Andy's view on this. The way that kind of the costs of retailer failures are being recovered. For example, through standing charges, as I understand it, on bills. So the standing charge is kind of a lump that you pay, and it's not really related to how much energy you're using. So yeah, Andy, what's your views on those distributional impacts?
Yeah,
no, absolutely. Sorry, Jan. Yes, no, it's a bit of a mess in truth, because in reality they're split across gas and electricity, and let me get this the right way around. It's the standing charge in electricity and the variable charge in gas, which is just a sort of a factor of history that we've ended up doing two opposite approaches. So absolutely, I think that's one of the things to review. I think it's not quite, I think overall, I think having a standing charge feels the wrong answer, but we just got to have a proper more sophisticated look at it, because I think there are high using vulnerable customers, so it's not quite as simple as it looks. But absolutely, you're in this crazy situation where there's different approaches to electricity and gas, and yeah, let's look at that, because that's part of what's driving the bills. No, completely.
Okay, thank you. Does anyone else want to come into that discussion about how we manage the, in effect, make the retail prices more cost reflective? If not, I'm going to take one of what I would see as a related question that came up from Katerina Foka, which was asking about a point that Simon made in relation to that 10-point plan, around the hypothesis about an increase of load factors for nuclear and renewables, and asking whether there is capacity to do that to a greater extent, because as she's saying there, surely generators have a strong incentive to be operating at maximum load factors already. So what were the conditions that the IEA was modelling to increase those further? Simon, would you like to respond first?
Yeah, I'm happy to, but with the caveat that I didn't do the modelling, but I am sorry that I wasn't able to go into some of these individual points in more detail at the time. What we did is we looked across the EU, and across the EU, gas is certainly a dispatchable resource. There's a lot of attention on it at the moment for its flexibility, but it's not used exclusively as a flexible resource across the EU. There's still quite a bit of gas that's used in some places as a more constant electricity supply, and even now, some of that is getting dispatched. Quicker. So we're looking at the measures that can be taken in order to reduce reliance on Russian gas. We weren't necessarily trying to see which things the market would solve by itself. Some of these might not be strictly economic, but I think the key point here was around the biomass and the nuclear load factors, and why some of those are lower than we think they could be in certain plants across the EU. And the conclusion that we came to was that with attention from operators and governments, some of the problems, especially around prolonged outages in certain parts of Europe, some of those issues could actually be resolved in the near term, and some of the capacity factors could be raised, recognizing that indeed in most markets, there is an incentive for the nuclear operators to try to operate as much as possible. That isn't necessarily always happening for technical reasons, and there could be a significant amount of effort put in, I think, to elevating some of those load factors. And on the biomass side, the nature of incentives in certain countries means that they're not necessarily getting dispatched ahead of gas, and that that could be revisited. I think some of those issues are national context specific and might not resonate in the UK context. And if you want any more specificities, I would need to get back to our modelling team.
Okay, thank you. Do any of the other panel members want to respond to that? Do they have a view?
Just comment briefly, Jan, just to try and complement what Simon was saying. I mentioned, the nuclear fleet in France, where there's this big uncertainty, a kind of a type fault that was revealed. I mean, my understanding, they're getting mixed messages from some of the kind of remote sensing that they've been doing, and then actually they've done a bit more in detail examination of one of the reactors. So that's a big thing, and that's a kind of, it's a technical issue, and ultimately the base a safety issue that needs to be resolved. So you can't muck around with that sort of stuff. In Britain, the advanced gas cooled reactors have never really had a great record of availability. They've always been a problem. Some are worse than others. Okay, some of them are being retired. My understanding is that some more investment could extend some of the lifetime of one or two of them, so you might get some improvements there. And the other factor that influences capacity factors, your ability to utilize what's available, because the person making the comment is absolutely right. If you own that stuff, your incentive is to get as much out of it as possible, is system limits, network limits, and system stability limits. So with respect to network limits, we have seen this. We see this in Britain, transfers of power from north to south when it's windy are limited by the capacity of the network, and the investment in the network has tended to lag the need for that network capacity. So that has an impact. It's a little bit around the kind of, well, it still has an impact in terms of cost and everything. So it all adds to the bigger picture, really. So that network investment has to come along, and that's something we'll probably touch on in the second half. And system stability issues, again, there are issues there that my feeling is the system operator could have been addressing more quickly, but they tell us they're on the case now.
Great. Thank you. Yeah, Joanne.
And just one final comment on that. Let's not forget matching demand to supply so that we're not curtailing renewables. We've got flexible demand that can use renewables when they're generating to maximise utilisation of that resource.
Yeah, that's perhaps an opportunity to bring in a question from Maxine Frerk about, which Keith also alluded to, about wouldn't shifting demand allow us to use more of the renewables, which currently may be constrained off, rather than just using the same amount of gas to generate electricity. To what extent is the potential there? That would be my understanding as well, or has been my understanding. Is that wrong, that we can't really make that adjustment in the current network system? I don't know whether Keith would like to have a quick comeback on that, or if not, I'll move on.
Yeah, well, the answer is yes. And it's been a sort of holy grail for energy or electricity system economists, for, as Maxine knows and others, for years and years. The ability to measure the time at which you use electricity is a key thing to kind of rewarding you for using it at different times, and therefore incentivizing it. So maybe it does, come back to market. I mean, Rob talked about this earlier as well. So that's the main thing that so-called smart meters do, is measure more accurately the energy that you're using and the time at which you're using it. So if the prices vary, and the prices do vary from half hour to half hour, so that that they will be lower when they're when it's windier and sunnier, then there ought to be an incentive. But then the next bit is how easy can you make it to do it? Some commercial customers, users, and industrial users can do it, and they've got the wherewithal and facilities, but it's much harder when you come down to a sort of household level.
Okay, thank you. Simon, and then Rob.
I think some of this discussion that we're getting into now will set up the next session very nicely. I just wanted to come back on the nuclear point, because I checked our plans, and actually we had done some work on forthcoming nuclear plant retirements, which I thought was actually under a separate point. But it's included in this one on maximizing dispatch, maximizing sort of the dispatchable resource. So the 70 terawatt hours that we included in the point that the questioner was asking about does include the 5 nuclear plants that were the 4 that were scheduled in the EU to come offline this year, and then the 1 that was scheduled to come offline or is scheduled to come offline next year. Our recommendation was to do everything possible to extend the lives of those plants at least by a year. And I just wanted to say that Belgium actually did quite quickly afterwards announce that that's exactly the measure that they're going to be taking.
Hey, Rob, and then Andy.
Yeah, it's kind of a bit similar, but with a more UK specific orientation to it. I think there's a very legitimate conversation around the economic, and obviously nobody wants nuclear power stations running that won't be safe. But the Office for Nuclear Safety has a very clear ring-fenced role in making those judgments in the UK case with regard to life extension for some of the older AGR, advanced gas cooled reactors, one of which is scheduled to close in July. So it seems to me that there is a direct relationship between some of the arguments that we've been putting forward around price stability, because our CFD idea offers some price stability. Now, you might think that there is a very obvious case that when prices are high, older reactors would seek as much life extension as possible. But it's also important to bear in mind that most investors would would have to make an assumption that prices will revert to mean in about 2 years, because we don't know what's going to happen to prices, and you're not going to persuade potential providers of finance for something that might be expensive. That we've got such a great crystal ball that we can see that we can now predict prices will stay high for a prolonged period of time. So they can't make that assumption. So actually, there might be decisions that are being made with regard to life extension that could be the economics of which could flip on a relatively small amount of additional revenue stability for a relatively short period of time. And so it's quite important that we look in detail and case by case, first of all at nuclear life extension, following on from that at any renewable schemes repowering that might be in the offing in the next few years. Because to come to one of the other questions, why would anyone go for my idea when they're under the RO? Well, one reason that they might is because they're coming towards the end of their RO contract, and some of the older schemes are. And it's possible that those schemes will just close. So whether or not the differences in all of this stuff is marginal or material, it's all in the detail of it, but it's certainly important to look at. One very, very, very quick point is we can't demand response ourselves out of geographically specific network constraints. If there's not enough demand in a particular sparsely populated place where it's windy, then we just need to build a bigger wire. We can't do that in time for next winter, but we need to do it and stop pretending we can do clever things to get around that.
Okay, right, we're straying here into next year's jobs, aren't we? So after the break. Andy.
Thanks, Jan. So I agree on the need for strategic investment, but obviously this is just a bit pick up on there is a use for demand response. So we're completely supportive of more cost reflective pricing to allow consumers to get full value for the flexibility they give, which lowers costs for everyone. And I think also answers that point about consumers being part of the energy transition rather than having it done to them. I just wanted to observe that we do have to think about the protections at the same time, that there will be consumers who can't be flexible. So we've got to make sure the protections are there, that we're not creating detrimental impacts for some customers who might be vulnerable.
Great. Yeah, thank you. There's just one question in there that we should come back to, I feel, which I think we won't be covering so much this afternoon, which is how do we get those landlords to optimize the efficiency of their rental properties? Maybe, really fast answers from each, but with Joanne leading.
So we've got minimum energy efficiency standards for private rented landlords. They will be being increased by government, and basically that's the way to do it. They have to do it. They have to be properly enforced. It's got to become illegal to rent a property that tenants can't afford to live in and can't be healthy living in. Government has made a start. We need to ramp it up. We need to enforce it better.
Absolutely. Does anyone else want a final word on that, or other matters that they have a pressing need to say something? If not, I'm going to say thank you very much to everyone, for our audience in particular, for contributing to the debate, and to our presenters for coming up with a huge range of suggested and very practical, I think, changes that could be made in the next few weeks to help to get everyone through, and I would say everyone through the next winter and the immediate challenges that we're facing over the cost of living. Are we facing some interesting points about to what extent are we in a kind of emergency here, and do we perceive ourselves to be? And always, to me, a perplexing issue of why is it that in GB, certainly, we don't seem to be able to take demand reduction and energy use seriously alongside supply. We've always, my whole period of time working in this, the focus, and indeed the focus in the latter part of our discussion, has come back to those questions about supply. So I'll stop there. Big thank you to everyone, and a reminder that we are back online at 11, I think, Rob, correct me if I'm wrong, but 11 o'clock, yeah. And we look forward to picking up some more of those questions about next steps from then. Meanwhile, hope you've got enough money to boil your kettle.